Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation on harnessing an enabling environment for women's economic empowerment post-pandemic. I'm Kelly Rogers. I'm an associate editor for Devex, coming to you from Montana. And welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining from wherever you are. This is an event hosted in partnership with Atlas Network, and you can follow the conversation online using the hashtag #DignityUnbound and hashtag DevexEvent. Now, an enabling environment hopefully reduces the barriers that women face to economic participation, whether those are legal, regulatory, or cultural. So it's just as important, let's say, to look at the role of traditional gender norms as it is to look at the legislative and constitutional frameworks that might define economic participation in a certain context. Ensuring the right indicators and information exist is also essential if women's specific needs as workers, as business owners, as entrepreneurs are to be met. And there are a lot of great efforts actually already to measure gender inequality in economic rights emerging in academic research, and also bottom up from local NGOs who are using that research, leveraging it to really achieve reform. So today we're going to get into the need to support local solutions for women's economic empowerment, as well as ways to measure success in order to build a more inclusive approach to grant making and other programming. And we have a wonderful panel of experts with us today to help us do that. But before I introduce them, I do just have a few notes. I'd like to introduce you first to Jack, who is our talented live illustrator with us today, and he'll be turning our words into art. So we will periodically check in with him to see how that creation is coming along. We will also move to a Q&A toward the end of the hour. So please use the chat box to enter those questions as they pop into your mind, and we'll be monitoring those and ensuring that they reach the appropriate panelist. If you are a note taker like I am, don't fret, because we will be sharing the full recording of this conversation as well as the illustration with you after the conclusion of the event. And I can't forget polls. We'll also have 3 polls throughout the event just to get our audience's take on a couple of important issues very related to women's economic empowerment. So watch out for those and be sure to cast your vote. And actually, if I could ask our producer to put up the first poll now. The question is, what is the key underlying challenge behind women's economic empowerment today? So be sure to, I'll give you a moment to cast your vote there. And in the meantime, to give you a minute to digest that question and cast your vote, I'd actually like to invite Matt Warner, who is the president of Atlas Network, to make a few opening remarks for us today. So Matt, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Kelly. I appreciate it. I am delighted to be here today. Greetings, everyone. My name is Matt Warner. I'm president of a nonprofit called Atlas Network. We are a grant-making organization that works with local NGOs in more than 90 countries to achieve systemic change. And today's event is part of our hashtag #DignityUnbound project. The World Bank is estimating that because of COVID-19, 70 million people may slip back into extreme poverty. We can't let that happen. So what can we do? Well, during this time of uncertainty, it's important that as we all work to rebuild our economies, that we remember the things that we know that work well. Equal access to market participation is one of the most effective strategies for increasing economic opportunity. We know that inclusive markets are the key to ending poverty. And yet unfair barriers, whether intended or not, continue to keep so many people from achieving their own prosperity. My organization is committed to helping local NGOs remove those barriers in countries all over the world. And our grantees benefit from the kind of cross-country comparisons that we're going to learn more about today. And this is so important because we all learn from each other as we lead at the local level. So whether it's starting a business or protecting ancestral land or benefiting from the same freedoms that others enjoy to work where and how they choose, women still face considerable barriers to economic opportunity. Those barriers keep people poor, but more importantly, they deny human dignity, and ultimately, they frustrate human potential and human flourishing. I'm looking forward to listening and learning today from our impressive and inspiring speakers about the opportunities that we all have right now to support positive change to unleash more human potential to flourish. The encouraging news is that before COVID, we were seeing a lot of positive change towards strengthening economic rights for women. And much of that change was happening fastest in the places that need it most. We know that greater equality leads to increased workforce participation for women and progress towards closing the wage gap. And in these uncertain times, we need to do more, not less, to increase flexibility in the marketplace, to give more people room to find their own way to new solutions that work for them. Now is the time for rapid reforms to make markets more inclusive, particularly where there are gender disparities. When we do that, we can be sure that people living in low-income communities will prove very capable of building a new future for themselves and their families. I believe that because I've seen it. I've seen it everywhere from Burundi to India, in Argentina, in the United States, where we are also active. And we'll hear more today specifically about the cases of Indonesia and Nepal. The work that these incredible speakers are doing is restoring human dignity. So I thank you for being part of this exciting event. I want to thank Devex for leading on this issue and hosting this very timely conversation. And if you're inspired by today's conversation, I invite you to use that hashtag #DignityUnbound and tell us about your experience. And visit our new website, dignityunbound.org, where we are telling the stories of human flourishing that come when people are given the chance to thrive. Thank you, Kelly. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Matt. And thanks for sort of centering this conversation for us around dignity. Before we get started and introduce our panelists, I'd love to share the results of our first poll. If our producer could share those results with me. All right, so the question was, what is the key underlying challenge behind women's economic empowerment today? And our audience has voted 71% that it's gender roles and norms over lack of economic rights and lack of paid employment opportunities. So that's interesting, and that's definitely something that we will be getting into with our panelists, who I'll introduce you to now. So if I could be joined on the screen by Arpita Nepal, who is the co-founder and advisor of research and development at Samriti Foundation. Taya Trumbek, who is a program manager for women business and the law at the World Bank. And Anthea Haryoko, who is head of external relations at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. So a warm welcome to all of our panelists. We're very glad you could join us today. Anthea, I want to send the first question to you because I know that the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies works with the understanding that Indonesians must have the rights and capacities to own their local resources. So can you give me a sense of some of the legal or regulatory barriers that women in Indonesia face right now in terms of economic empowerment, economic participation?
Sure. So in Indonesia, we have this interesting boom in the e-commerce sector, and the informal businesses tend to run to these e-commerce platforms just because it's easy to set up shop, and also that informal businesses in Indonesia are predominantly owned by women. So women find there's a lot of appeal in creating these informal businesses run on e-commerce platforms. However, there are some new developments in regulations in Indonesia that are threatening the opportunities for women to start businesses and run businesses online. And that is the requirement for online sellers to register as a formal business. Again, most of these businesses are informal and unregistered. And also to have the permit to sell online. So there are a few regulations that might not be explicitly targeting women, but unintentionally hitting a sector where women are predominantly present in. So these are one of the areas that we're trying to showcase. And in our research, we're trying to say that, look, if you do these things, women are going to be impacted, especially now when women are most affected by a lot of the job losses, because many work in the lower, the base sectors of the value chains, like in garment factories, in customer-facing services. So then women are then seeking alternative sources of income for their households. And you are essentially blocking a potential opportunity for women to gain more income and participate in Indonesia's economy. So that's one of the examples that I can highlight for the Indonesian context. And also that migrant workers as well have been, even before the pandemic, have been barred from going to places like the Middle East, for example, because of cases of abuse. But the cases of abuse are 0.5%, I understand, from the total number of women migrants. And so the policies that have come out there have been rather extreme. I mean, of course, we have to address the cases of abuse, but it's the quality of policies in response to these cases drastically reduce the opportunities for women to find incomes outside of Indonesia. And therefore, our job is to highlight how these regulations are disproportionately impacting women. So yes, that's from Indonesia.
Thanks, Anthea. And a quick follow-up question, Matt mentioned in his remarks that we've seen backsliding in progress toward more inclusive markets, of course, due to this global health crisis. Is that something that you've seen in Indonesia? And when we're talking about even e-commerce and some of these regulations, is there more of sort of an urgency now to address these things because of this crisis?
Yep, absolutely. So I think as even if a woman is working in the formal sector, we've all had the experience of working from home. And I think it's the polls showed that gender norms are one of the challenges in women's economic participation. And so, and especially in Indonesia, those social norms definitely assume that women were to take on more household responsibilities. And so the burden adds on more, especially for child rearing. And if you have aging parents in your household, then that's an additional factor in what burdens women at home and their economic participation. So yeah, I raise e-commerce because that's been a very appealing platform for women to find an income, because if you have an online shop, you have more time flexibility as well. So you can also manage the responsibilities you have in your homes while seeking opportunities to generate income. And so the regulations to force online merchants to become formal businesses and pay taxes and all of that is kind of increasing the barriers towards those opportunities. And if anybody has tried to open a business, a formal business, or gone through Indonesian bureaucracy, they'll know it's a very complicated and costly process. And if you're a businesswoman, you'll find that that's sometimes not going to be worth the resource allocation to do. So that's definitely a concern for us, and we're trying to dig deeper into about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Anthea. Arpita, you do a lot of work also to help create an enabling environment for women entrepreneurs in Nepal. And part of that involves advocacy, of course. So I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about working with policymakers and maybe a few lessons you've learned in that regard.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me over on the event. It's wonderful to share some of my experiences. So having worked a lot with policymakers in general, and even women policymakers in general, as the poll suggested, definitely gender norms comes into play whenever we're trying to address any kind of regulatory issues on whether women representatives themselves get heard or not. However, there is, I think, a very positive role that think tanks like ours can actually play in this spectrum. That is in terms of democratic participation of women policymakers in general is a new concept in countries like mine. In Nepal, the women participation in politics is a slowly increasing rate, and that came out of, say, a constitutional provision of 33% of having like women candidates and so on and so forth. However, sometimes when you make provisions like these, what you don't realize is you get women participation, but only in name. Women who have the ability to actually voice these kind of representation or come with this backup support is not necessarily there for these women policymakers. So one role that think tanks like mine play in Nepal is providing a lot of policy support to help women representatives in general understand what these gendered issues are, and also to sort of defend, why certain provisions need to be made. Having said that, the poll results to me that you shared initially is quite interesting, because we keep blaming gender norms, and it's sort of like it becomes, I think, to a certain extent, a scapegoat in terms of blaming everything on this very, very complex issue of like patriarchal society or gender norms. The question is, how do you address something like this? And if you don't think that there is this, personally speaking, and given my experience of working especially with women entrepreneurs and working specifically only on women economic empowerment per se, I see that an important role is making the playing field level enough for women. As Matt initially talked about, it's creating equal access to opportunities to participate in the market. And I think that's doubly hard for women, given these gendered norms, is how do you break these gendered norms, right? So if you're able to economically empower women and create these role models, I think that's when you start breaking some of these gendered norms of what women can do or cannot do. And in order to create that, you need to create equal access to opportunities. And so women, I think, face sort of a double challenge in that, especially in societies like mine, is where you have to face this, you have to fight two battlefronts. One is at the home front, where you want to establish yourself as, say, for example, an earner, an income generator, as somebody who can bring in value to this partnership in the family. So you're fighting that battle on the family front, but once you have to go outside and fight in the market, not just in the simple, not just in terms of the competition that you face in market in general, but also in terms of the bureaucracy that you face in order to actually face this competition. I think when you have these complex bureaucratic organizations, that is what challenges women in general. I think that creates like a double challenge in general. So having said that, I think like there are a lot of instances where policymakers with very good intentions try and create these positive discriminatory policies for women. But there are a lot of perverse consequences of these policies that we don't even think about on the onset. So I think those are some of the challenges that my organization, an organization like mine, I don't think we're unique in that. There are a lot of organizations in Nepal like mine that are dealing with these challenges of trying to educate policymakers and saying, like, whenever you make these kind of provisions, just if I can give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. So say, for example, there is a tax probate that you receive if you register an enterprise in the name of a woman. So this is essentially, this tax provision was created as a positive discrimination practice that in order to encourage women entrepreneurs. But what that perversely has done is it still does not give women any kind of power per se, but what it does is, in a sense, it encourages men to use their wife, their mothers, their sisters. So all the businesses suddenly are registered in our name. So the data shows that, there seems to be a lot of women participation, but the actual decision making still does not lie in the hands of women, right? And on the other hand, you're creating sort of a rift in the family situation where, if as an assertive woman, I really do want to assert my economic rights because the business is registered in my name, now I have to fight two battles, one with my family and one on the other front of actually claiming these, tax probates and so on and so forth. So I think sometimes policies have perverse consequences and they really need to be thought through. The goal ultimately should be creating equal access to opportunities. And that's something that's the struggle we've been having or dealing with in Nepal in general.
Thanks so much, Arpita. Anthea and Arpita, you've both already given me so much to think about. One of them is the unintentional consequences of, even good intentions, basically. And the other is, and Arpita, you just mentioned this, got into the data a little bit. So just because the data shows one thing doesn't necessarily tell the story of, how much power a woman might actually hold as a result of whatever that policy was. Really interesting fodder, I think, and a perfect segue, I think, to Taya, because I want to go to you and ask how much of this is actually about ensuring the right indicators and information exist in order to meet women's needs. And can you share some of your efforts at the bank to measure gender inequality within economic rights?
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. The good news is that we know more today than we used to. There's more data and there's more studies out there that show that gender equality has economic benefits. And so it's easier to make our point. At the World Bank, the Women, Business, and the Law Project has been collecting data over the last 11 years, and this has helped us do additional research to show exactly these economic benefits. So we focus specifically on the law and how the law treats men and women differently when it comes to access to women's economic opportunities. And so we have been able to show that this benefits not only women. So when laws are more equal and give women equal access to opportunities as men, this does not only benefit women, and this, we can see this in increased labor force participation or lower gender wage gaps, but there are also economic benefits for the whole economy. There's more economic growth, and we see better development outcomes in both education and health. And so what is Women, Business, and the Law? It is an index that looks at different stages of a woman's working life and how the law impacts each of these stages. We start with just looking at freedom of movement, which has been associated with increased financial inclusion and more entrepreneurship. And then we look at how laws affect women's ability to start jobs and stay in the workplace. We also look at very important barriers to women's economic participation, which are laws that specifically prohibit women from working in certain sectors and certain jobs. For example, in Sierra Leone, women cannot work in mines, and they can, in many countries, they cannot work at night. And these are precisely areas where there are better paid jobs. And so if women are from the outset prevented from this leads to lower pay. And when we talk about social gender norms, we've often at the Women, Business, and the Law Project talk about which comes first. If women are paid less and there's a crisis like this and women have to take time off to take care of children, which partner in the household is going to quit their job? It's the one that is paid less. And so these legal discriminations directly impact women's opportunities and choices. And I'm glad Arpita brought up the struggle that women face, not only in the workplace where we have made great strides, but also at home. So convincing our families and partners that we can contribute equally has been also a big struggle. And I think that's one where we see the biggest gap. So when we look at our data, the biggest gaps that we see are related to women's pay. So these laws that restrict women's opportunities, and what happens to when women become parents and get married. Often the burden of care falls on the woman. And so we look at things like, is there adequate paid maternity leave? Is there paternity leave, parental leave that allows both parents to share the burden of taking care of their children? We also look at laws that prevent women from starting and participating as entrepreneurs, as Anthea had mentioned. They often face additional hurdles in being able to start a company because they need additional documentation or permission. We look at restrictions to inheritance, which affects both informal and formal employees. So if you cannot inherit when your husband dies or your father dies equally as your brother or father, then that prevents also your access to finance and ability to build capital. And finally, we look at the very last stage of a woman's working life, which is when it comes to retirement, how laws impact the size of women's pensions. We know that women live longer, but often because they've had to take time off to take care of children and they were paid less, they're left with less money and they're often forced to retire earlier. And so they live longer but have less money, and this leads to inequality in old age as well. So the Women, Business, and the Law report in our latest findings, we find that today, globally, women have only 3/4 of the legal rights that men have. And there are only 8 countries that achieved the highest score in our index. And these 8 countries have achieved this highest score only in the last 10 years. So there has been reform. There has been reform in all areas of the world. And as Matt had said, we have seen an increased pace, especially in the regions that need it the most and in these areas that I mentioned, pay and parenthood. But it has been very slow. And the risk that we face now is that we can walk back some of the progress that we have made. So I really hope at the World Bank, we are working on many different ways to make sure that gender equality remains a priority for policymakers so that we can rebuild economies during the pandemic and in the consequences that will come after. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Taya, for framing that in sort of a more global perspective for us. That's really helpful. And I want to get back to those 8 countries with the highest score because I'm interested to hear a little bit more in detail about those. But first, I wonder if we should take a break for another poll. If our producer could put that up on the screen for us. So the question is, what will be most important in ensuring women's economic empowerment as we build back? And your options are ensuring women's economic rights, tackling structural inequalities, and more localized women's economic empowerment programs. So be sure to cast your vote, and we will revisit the results in just a minute. And I see we're also sharing Jack's screen, and his visual creation is looking wonderful. So Anthea, let's get into a little bit on how you're working at the local level to ensure that the most helpful information exists on some of these issues, and sort of ultimately help ensure that women's specific needs are better understood. And I know we were talking yesterday about childcare services, and this is something also that Taya and our Pita have also mentioned already. So I wonder if you could use that as an example.
Let me unmute myself.
Yeah.
Sure. What we are starting on now is exploring a marketplace for childcare services. We are seeing especially the rate of women after they become mothers is quite low when they want to return to the workforce. And I mean, this can be for various reasons. I mean, a woman might choose to prefer not to work and raise their children and family, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But the problem lies when women want to go back to the workplace. They need additional services and support that will enable or alleviate some of the household burdens or childcare burdens they have in order for them to reallocate their time to enter the workforce or perhaps even start a business. So we are exploring what the regulations are that prevents such a marketplace from happening, because I think one of the regulations that we found was that a child care center cannot be within 1.5 kilometers of each other, which is really unusual and arbitrary. And if you are in a community where there are a lot of mothers in need of a childcare service, and they would have, obviously it would be very troublesome for them to bring the child to work if the workplace has any childcare services, so they might prefer somewhere close to their neighborhood. And somebody can't start a childcare service just because of this regulation of distance. It's bizarre. So we are trying to spotlight these regulations that unintentionally, perhaps even, are stopping the choices for women that would enable them to enter the workforce or participate in the economy. So we're doing that work at the moment. We are researching, asking around, like, who are the entrepreneurs who want to start these childcare services, these early childcare centers as well. And we hope to highlight that these policies and make the recommendations to policymakers to say that, look, if you want to recover economically, we're going to have all the talent pool we need to get the economy running again. And if you have these regulations who are stopping basically half the country's talent pool, it's in your best interest to change these policies. So yeah, that's an example I can share with you of what we do.
Thanks so much. Now I wonder if we can share the poll results with our audience. All right, so this one was a little bit closer, but most people voted that tackling structural inequalities will be most important in ensuring women's economic empowerment as we build back. So it was about 54%, and 34% went with more localized women's economic empowerment programming, looks like. And I know that we've already discussed some of these structural inequalities, but I wanted to go to Arpita, who I know works a lot with women entrepreneurs. And one piece of creating an enabling environment is grant making for women's economic empowerment programs. And donors are, of course, very involved in this. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on how donors can improve ways to measure success in order to build more inclusive approach to grant making for these programs, and also maybe even Arpita, get your take on how gender norms play into that as well.
Both very difficult questions in general, I think. I have no solutions per se. I just know what I've seen through my experience in Nepal. One thing, and I think a lot of donors working in Nepal have definitely realized this, and are also moving a lot away from these kind of programs. So a lot of women economic empowerment programs done by typical bilateral, multilateral organizations or individual donors in the past focused on, everybody thought imparting skills to women in general is what is going to make them economically empowered. So I think the perverse effect of these kind of donor programs was we had whole villages of women trained in sewing and knitting. So who's going to open the tailor shop or the sewing shop or the knitting shop, or who's going to run this enterprise? Nobody was really clear about that. What this unfortunately also did was a lot of programs like this that focuses on trying to impart certain skills and trainings of this kind to women, or donor programs focus on this kind. What it also does is, I think it created a lot of additional gender norms now that we have to deal with. Because traditionally, because of these kind of programs, what happened was sewing, knitting, beautician, all of these kinds now come with a gendered notion of only women. These are women's jobs. So if a woman actually goes out into the job market to try and grab an economic opportunity, she's going to open up a tailoring shop, a sewing shop, or something like that. So this created additional gender norms that women had to now fight for. So I think, in a sense, a lot of donors to date, I think, have moved away. This was very much the approach even up to early 2000s in Nepal. But I think the focus now has been on how can we create women's group at the local level that are able to run enterprises by themselves. So, addressing things like how do we help them develop a business plan? How do we help them, teach about like how to run an enterprise? What kind of regulatory barriers are they likely to face? How are they going to deal with the government bureaucracy in general regarding the sector that they're interested in? So these are, I think, more beneficial in general, at least in case of Nepal. I can for sure claim that this has created better results. I think in terms of access to finance, I think is the biggest problem for women, because most women's access to capital traditionally in a lot of countries like mine are limited owing to certain legal restrictions. Say, for example, inheritance laws. Inheritance laws were revised as, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago in Nepal. So they haven't been around all that long in Nepal in general. Their ownership of property in general. So those kind of legal rights are just recently being changed. And so not a lot of women have actually realized the benefits of these changes. And so in that sense, women don't have the collateral to start up. So in that sense, a lot of cooperative movement in Nepal has worked in favor of women, small and micro women entrepreneurs in Nepal in general. So I think any kind of drive to help women entrepreneurs more towards access to finance is another very good policy direction in general. The third thing that we have also been working is, like I mentioned in my earlier talk, is we're trying to help policymakers realize these perverse consequences of policies that are made with good intentions. You might think that a certain positive action creates a lot of beneficial opportunities for women. On the other hand, it creates a whole lot of additional barriers. So a recent example is we have like a local Uber kind of company, which also allows motorcycle riders, because we've got narrow streets. There are a lot of motorcycle riders. So there are a lot of urban women who want to participate in this, market. And they were very easily able to participate in this market. The reason for that would be they knew how to ride scooters. They could offer their services. The timing was perfect. And the online registration for this process was really simple for them. women. So this is specifically for urban women who are able to drive scooters, say for example, and offer a ride to a pillion rider. But the government suddenly came up with this idea. It's like, oh, we haven't regulated this market, so we need to have all the drivers go through this standardized process of testing and creating certain standards. This is just creating an additional barrier in general for for women, because this is a market where generally young women are participating quite a lot. So, there are these kind of policies where I think there are a lot of perverse consequences that policymakers don't necessarily realize. So the other thing in general that I think that local organizations can do is create, become a liaison between the stakeholders, the actual women on the ground who are facing these issues, and become the link between them and their policymakers, helping them realize what kind of issues that they're facing. So that's my general response.
Thanks so much, Arpita. That was really helpful. And Taya, your work has focused on regulatory framework analysis of the business environment in several countries, in many countries actually globally. So you have a sense of what works, I think. So I guess I'm curious, is there a formula? And if we could get back maybe to those 8 countries with the highest score on the index, what are some examples of the legislative reforms that worked, and maybe even recent examples?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So the 8 countries that I mentioned that have achieved a score of 100 are mostly in Western Europe, and we've just recently welcomed Canada in the last year's report. So it's Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Latvia, Luxembourg, and Sweden. And we have been asking precisely this question: how have some countries achieved better outcomes than others, and what is it that really leads governments to pay attention to this? And some of these reforms are very controversial. Things related to inheritance, access to land is quite difficult to reform. And so as we know, governments have limited time in office, and they want to spend their political capital in things that make them popular. And so what makes gender equality a popular subject? And we felt that we didn't know enough about the subject. And so what we have done over the last year and a half or so is we've gone back in time and we've recalculated and looked at how these laws changed in places like Sweden and Belgium that have 100 score today. What did it look like in 1970? And these results are fascinating, because as I mentioned today, the average global score is 75. In 1970, it was 50. So women globally had only half the legal rights of men. In places like Belgium, the United Kingdom, France, that today have fairly equal laws, did not have them. So, Belgium that scores 100 today had a score of 38 in 1970. Women couldn't sign contracts without their husband's permission. They were limited in access and decision making. And so what we are doing right now is doing additional research to understand how did change come about. Was it civil society that advocated for this change? What changed that really made them focus on this? And I think it's a holistic approach. What we've seen in places like Sweden, Sweden, Canada, many of the countries that score the highest, they have something called a feminist foreign policy. And they really take a feminist approach to looking at all of their policy making. So not related only to women, but also to their foreign policy, to their economics. And I think they've recognized that women are not a minority. Women make up 50% of the world's population, and countries cannot grow if they're excluding half of their population. And so this is something that we're seeing not only in countries that score really well, but also in countries that perform very poorly. And so in our last year's report, we also presented the top 10 countries which reformed the most and had the biggest increase. And of those 10 countries, 9 were from Sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East, and 1 was from South Asia, and it was Nepal, or Pita. Nepal had the 3rd largest improvement in the score. And this is showing us that really countries are starting to realize the potential of the law. Of course, law without proper implementation doesn't achieve the effects that we want, but it's a foundational first step in showing that this government is committed to gender equality, and we're starting with the rules that govern our society. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Taya. With that, I would love to introduce our final poll to get our audience's take on how donors can better support more inclusive women's economic empowerment programs. So if I could have our producer present that poll. So it's by supporting more flexible reporting and M&E structures, by building more on-the-ground accountability mechanisms, and by making it easier for local NGOs to access grants. So those are your options. So please cast your vote. And while you're doing that, Arpita, I wanted to revisit really quickly legalization and the discrepancy among maybe a legal change and its implementation. So just because a law is on the books does not mean, that it's effective for women, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that women know it's a law on the books that they can, use to their advantage. So is there an example of Nepal of maybe a law that, or a regulation that you've kind of bridged that gap with? And to kind of give us a sense of like, this can work and here's how?
Right. So in general, I think whenever a law actually creates equal rules for everybody, defeating some gendered norms, I think that is when success happens. So just to give an example of what we worked with in terms of company registration, the reason we worked with company registration was like even though it was taken online, the whole process had a series of 27 different signatures that you have to just collect only from the company registrar's office. And even though the whole process is online, supposedly online, you still had to be physically present in this only one company registrar's office that was only located in Kathmandu. So the capital city. So everybody, all the entrepreneurs from around the country had to come to Kathmandu. So this was the biggest challenge because Nepal is filled with mom and pop stores, and mom and pop stores can be started with the smallest amount of capital. You actually see the entrepreneurial spirit of Nepali people as you walk outside in any sort of street in Nepal, is just the proliferation of these mom and pop stores. And these are mostly run by women. Most of these mom and pop stores might not be physically registered in their name, but they're mostly run by women because it's at the house. They can do their household duties at the same time run these stores. So we did this research a couple of years ago, and we figured out, what are all these entry barriers. So a lot of these mom and pop stores essentially, functioned in the informal economy. So the first thing we did in terms of reform was trying to get commitment from the government that they're going to reduce this registration time to 15 days. Essentially, it used to take like 3 months for the whole registration process. The second sort of commitment that we got, and we worked with the mom and pop stores owners, most of whom are women, and worked with policymakers on the other side, is we tried to get them to bring down the registration to the ward office. So the ward is the local governance unit. It's your nearest government that you can go to register your store. Paying their taxes at that places, so that it's very easy access for these shop owners just to walk over on any given day, an hour of your time, and you already know the people who work in that ward office, because ward is the smallest locality in the urban unit within Nepali government system. So we worked with policymakers on trying to phase that. It's been implemented on a phase-wise manner. So Kathmandu has that rule in place right now, and it's working quite effectively. So in that sense, a couple of positive outcomes of that: the government was able to formalize a lot of these places. Because of this formalization, in general, tax revenues are easier to generate. And also people can just legally operate their enterprise. That means you have got expansion opportunity, you've got access to finance, you have got collateral. These are business expansion opportunities in general. So in general, we worked with both the stakeholders and policymakers to bring about some of these changes. It hasn't been uniformly applied throughout Nepal because we are in the process of federalization. Our laws are a mess at the moment, including business regulatory laws. So it's been a challenge, but we have partner think tanks around all our states right now. and they're working with their respective local government to sort of, synchronize these kind of business registration processes. So it wasn't something that was specifically targeted just to women entrepreneurs, but at the same time, what we figured out was by having these laws that, by identifying the specific laws that hits women entrepreneurs the worst, I think you're helping them even better, trying to synchronize and reduce the regulatory burden in general. Because like I said, women have to fight two battles. So, if you make battling out in the market easier for them, then they can pick up their battles at home easier. So yeah, that's one
Absolutely.
positive change.
Thanks so much for that example, Arpita. And before we move to audience Q&A, and that is a nudge to keep those questions coming. We have some great ones already, but just a reminder that we are going to move to Q&A, and our panelists would love to answer as many questions as they can. But first, let's reveal the results of that final poll, if we could. So how can donors better support more inclusive women's economic empowerment programs? Let's see here. It's almost split. So it's by building more. Okay, so I can't actually. Okay, so by making it easier for local NGOs to access grants is definitely the clear winner. But by building more on-the-ground accountability mechanisms is a close second. So interesting. Thank you, audience, for those thoughts. And now let's move into our Q&A, just to ensure that we do have time to get to some of these questions. And I want to start with a question for Anthea. Have you seen partnerships with banks and e-commerce platforms that enable easy access to e-commerce markets, including for informal businesses?
Absolutely. Actually, what has driven banks to change its, I guess you could say, their financial product offerings to target women especially, have been these e-commerce innovations that have sprouted in Indonesia. So there are a lot of homegrown innovations, local companies who have reached, I guess you can unicorn status, and these have forced banks to compete with them. And now you've seen, we are seeing a lot of integrations in terms of making payments more easily accessible. So making, for example, innovating a traditional bank where you would have to open a bank account at a branch, a physical branch. Now you can do it remotely through an app. And these things have been nudged further through a lot of the fintech and e-commerce products and companies that have sprouted in the country. So it's kind of revealed a market for financing women-owned businesses. And as Arpita has mentioned before, what a woman can offer as collateral is often different. Because the traditional banks would look at land assets or other financial information about the person, but with women, they're less likely to own land, for example. So what are the other ways that banks can adjust how they assess a creditworthiness for a women entrepreneur, for example? And a lot of the fintech financial tech products out there have been able to provide these alternative ways to ensure creditworthiness. So definitely the banks have been influenced, or their business, the way they operate, have definitely been influenced by these e-commerce platforms and fintech products that have sprouted here.
Great, thanks so much. For Taya, has your group looked at the impact of disparities in women's access to land due to either formal law or customary laws and practices? And if so, what have you found?
Oh, thank you, Kelly. We certainly have, and access to land was identified as one of the biggest obstacles that women face, and it's also one of the, when we look at legal barriers, this is one of the most difficult areas to tackle. But at least according to our latest data, this is the area where we have made huge progress. So a lot of laws around the world have made it equal, inheritance laws equal, and management of property. But here is where we are really lacking implementation. It's not something that women business and the law focuses on, but the World Bank has many programs working on land access. And I think there's been a lot of studies that show that we're still not there yet. This is where, despite the law, we're not seeing an increased access to land. There's a recent campaign that the World Bank has been part of. It's called, let me just make sure. I think it's called Her Land or Save Her Land or something like this. And it's, I think that there's a lot of programs that the bank is doing at the local level, working with governments and also local municipalities to ensure that women have equal access to land. But in many countries, we still don't even know, land is not titled. We don't even know who it belongs to. There's a lot of tribal issues in Africa around even people who've been living on their land having proper titles to it. And so we have a long way to go on that one.
Thank you. And this might be a good question for either Arpita or Anthea. I'll let you decide. But do you have any examples of good M&E initiatives that have contributed to the economic empowerment of women? Arpita?
If I can just, yeah, sorry. Sure. So one, I think M&E in general, or to avoid any kind of corruption, one practice that has been quite rampant and used also by donors and also local governments in Nepal right now is publishing the budget of the project in big, billboards kind of things that is visible to everyone in the village. So anybody with any kind of literacy power can read how much has been spent and raise questions at the local level. And I think this is a very simple M&E tool in general, publishing it so that the whole village can read how much is spent on, what kind of accounts, and it makes local level leaders highly accountable, also local NGOs highly accountable. So I think just publishing your whole project budget, not in terms of obscure headings where you can, sort of hide all the costs or administrative costs that you spend on a certain project, but, just delineating on exactly how much you're spending exactly on what activity, I think is quite effective.
Thank you.
And if I might be able to add on
Sure.
that, I think corruption is definitely a big issue in Indonesia as well. And we see that the more regulations you place, the more gateways somebody has to overcome, the more likely that that corruption will happen. So we have to be careful. It's not about the quantity of regulations that are issued, but the quality of it. And so that's something we should be wary about.
Thank you. And Taya, I might direct this one to you on public procurement. One of the areas of opportunity to empower women businesses is public procurement, an area where traditionally women-led businesses are underrepresented. Can governments do anything to level the playing field here? I wonder if that's anything that's come up in your research.
The Women Business in the Law Project doesn't look at that, but It has come up in discussions we've had at the World Bank. And I know that the World Bank itself is committed to walking the talk and trying to procure more. We've set certain targets to procure more from women-owned businesses, but our data does not speak to that yet.
Okay, no problem. I do have another. Oh, please, yeah.
Sorry, just to add on the public procurement, because it's one of the other issues, areas where I think there can be perverse consequences of like reserving certain amount of, public procurement should be done from women registered businesses. That just encourages a lot of, men running businesses to register the name, of the enterprise in some family member's name who happens to be a woman. So I think there are certain perverse policy consequences like that I think we need to avoid in general. And at least in Nepal, I can say for sure that public procurement, there are a lot less women enterprises involved for two reasons. A is basically the massive amount of capital requirement for fulfilling any kind of government contract that women don't have access to. And the second issue in this question in general is the amount of corruption involved, where women entrepreneurs generally we have seen are not very savvy about making these business deals.
Thank you.
That's a good point. If I could just add,
Sure.
The Doing Business Project, which looks at the laws for small and medium-sized enterprises, is adding a new indicator called contracting with the government, which is looking precisely at these type of rules around public procurement, which could affect those, as Arpita was saying, that might not want to deal with the bureaucracy. So making the process transparent, faster, but also ensuring that there's less corruption would have a big impact on women-owned businesses as well.
Great, thanks, Taya. And another question for Anthea, which I think is specifically about Indonesia, excuse me, isn't there still a big limitation on informal firms' ability to grow? Don't they need to formalize to grow?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because I think I don't want to demonize like formalization of businesses is bad, no, but the initial stage of a business creation, especially when you're looking at low income areas, it's easier to operate as an informal business first. So like I mentioned, there's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles when you want to register, when you want to become a formal business, a lot of paperwork, a lot of costs involved. You got to know certain connection in your local government, for example. And so sometimes it's not worth taking the effort to formalize a business. And so it's it also keeps a business a certain size. But that's not to say there aren't any benefits in formalizing a business. So I mentioned the example of the e-commerce thing. So what we are saying is not, not to discourage formalization of business, but to ease the process, make it more simple and more easier to access. Because obviously once a business grows to a certain size, it's eligible to be a formal business. You have more growth opportunities, as Arpita alluded to. You have access to certain credit opportunities to grow your business and so forth. But that initial seed stage for a low-income Indonesian, it is much more beneficial. The opportunities to grow your business in the informal sector is a lot bigger at the moment. Rather than immediately jumping to a formal business. So it's more like a process, an evolution of business creation that I think should be recognized. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question here that I wonder actually if I could have each of you answer really briefly. What do the panelists think of the impact of the economic restructuring that will result from COVID? As many of the sectors that pre-COVID employed women in the developing world, hospitality, apparel, retail, et cetera, are severely impacted, at least in the short and medium term. So what new economic opportunities do you see for women in the developing world, and how can donors and NGOs help? So super easy question to answer briefly, I realize. But Arpita, maybe we could start with you.
Very, very quickly, if we can just ease up the process of running a business from home, just make my life easy. If there are businesses opportunities, a very quick example, for example, there's a business in Kathmandu that's largely very women-centric, where if I make an additional dish in my kitchen, I can sell it to somebody else, but I don't have to be registered as a restaurant or like meet certain food standards, so and so forth, or deal with a whole lot of bureaucracy. It's an online platform where I say I made an extra meal today if somebody's interested in this additional recipe that I made, right? So very quickly, if you want to accommodate a lot of women coming back to the labor force, making things easier to run from home, I think is the first response that I would give.
Thanks so much, Arpita. Anthea?
Absolutely. And the thing is, like in Indonesia, we have this incredible digital economy sector. And if it would be a shame if women wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. And again, yes, creating a home industry or a business run from home has many advantages for women. And I think that that opportunity shouldn't be blocked.
Thanks so much, Anthea. And Taya?
Well, I would have to say that, some of the issues that we already knew about before are even more important now. So tackling issues around women's pay is extremely important, not restricting women to certain industries where they are now found to have lost their jobs or essential workers. And I think another area that we're seeing emerging is childcare services. And so sort of the enabling environment for parents, both men and women, to be able to have a family and work. I think we need to level the playing field there. And I think that's going to be even more important. Things like digital solutions are great, but women are still less likely to have access to that as well and to be proficient in using it. And so I think it has to be really a concerted effort between the private sector, government, civil society to enable women to access these services, to access justice during lockdowns, and to really be able to participate on equal footing.
Many thanks, Taya. And I do want to be cognizant that we are running short on time. So I'd just like to give a big thank you to Anthea, to Arpita, Taya, of course, Paul for kicking us off, and Jack for his artistic talent today. And thanks to you, our international audience, of course, for joining us today and participating in our polls. Today's conversation, I think, has offered really helpful insight on what works in creating an enabling environment, with really helpful examples, I think, from each of our panelists, and it really gave me some food for thought. Ideas on how to measure success and how to advocate for change, especially as we're trying to build back post-pandemic. So we will be sure to share a recording of this full conversation, as well as a copy of Jack's illustration with you following the conclusion of this event. But thanks again for your time today, and that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you.